Hello, my name is Joe Cartwright and welcome back to my studio. In today's painting we're going to be looking at three subjects. One is how to simplify a scene so you won't feel like you've got to paint every leaf in the landscape. Secondly, we're going to look at lost and found edges and how these can help connect the viewer to your painting. And thirdly, we're going to look at how to add depth to your painting through the correct use of tones and values. And along the way, I'm going to show you how to paint boats and their reflections, as well as how to capture the light in this subject. So let's get started. Sailboats normally have their mast a little bit towards the front of the boat. I'm sure there are exceptions, but that's what I do for my boats. And really, I don't go in for a lot of detail. I generally have a pointy end and a not so pointy end, and that's enough for a painting like this. The boats aren't the subject of this painting. I don't have to spend a lot of time on these boats because most of them will have foliage over them. When you're drawing in the boom, make sure that you don't make it too high. It's basically, its position is if someone was standing in the back of the boat, there's a chance they'll whack their head in it if they're not careful. Let's throw a couple of figures there. So here's my simple drawing. First thing you'll notice, I haven't put in any of these foreground trees. The reason for that is their position isn't critical. Plus, by not putting them in at the start, I can have a little bit of flexibility as to where I actually place them in the finished painting. I've also not drawn in all the additional masks that you can see as glimpses through the trees. I'll just draw them in with my masking fluid in a moment. Most of them are going to be covered. A number of these boats are going to be covered. The key boat I don't want to cover is this one and probably this little grouping here. The next step before I do anything else is to mask the boats. So the first step is I get a little bit of dishwashing liquid. And probably about ½ an inch of water or a centimetre of water. And I'll stir that up. This brush started life looking like this, But about 20 years ago, because I didn't use this soap technique, I managed to stick a lot of masking fluid to the hairs, and the only way to get it out was to cut it out. And I was about to throw the brush away, but I noticed that I ended up with a lovely little point on my brush. And so I've kept it, and it comes in very handy for masking the masks and small boats like these. My process is I start by dipping my brush in the soapy water, take out about 90% of the water, then dip it into the masking fluid. You have to do this before you wet the back of the paper. It's got to be done on totally dry paper. And after I dip it in the masking a couple of times, I wash it out again. And that'll do. And now I've got to let that thoroughly dry. First step is going to be to wet the back of my paper. While that's sitting there, let's mix some colours. Got some cobalt blue for the sky, darker blue, green colour for the distant hill. And that'll just get us started. That'll do. And for the distant hill, I really don't need very much of that. Some French ultramarine. A little bit of cobalt turquoise. Some aureolin and some raw umber, just to dull it a bit. And that'll do. Let's wet the back again. Going to make that lighter. And I'll soften this edge here. That way I won't get a hard edge underneath the foliage when I paint it. And this distant hill is going to be primarily a soft edge, but I have to wait a little while. If I go in too soon, the paint will just immediately flow down. So what I'm going to do, just wait a moment, take this opportunity just to clear some of the paint that's on my board. I'm going to give it a very light hit with the hairdryer. You can see there's just a hint of moisture, but not all that shine that was there before. Now, I'll grab my darker paint. I'm going to take about 3/4 of the water out. And you can see here I'm getting just an in-between soft edge. Just some of this paint is flowing up to hint at distant trees. And it'll be a bit darker down here, and there's hints of valley. So what I'm going to do, pick up some of this paint, add some more paint to it, just creating a darker tone. And there's a bit of warm light hitting the top of this hill. I'm going to just drop some cad orange into that. That'll do. Now we need to let that dry. While that's drying, let me mix some colours for this main hill here. So we've got quite a bright green, and we've got a dull green and a cool green. So I'm going to start with some very weak cad orange. A bit weaker. And then some cobalt turquoise. Some aureolin. That's our warm colour. Don't need too much of this other colour. This is a cooler green, so we'll start with aureolin and some cobalt turquoise. Just a small amount of raw umber. And for the dark green, I can use what I had there as a base, and I'll just add French ultramarine and raw umber. While these are darker greens, I've got to make sure they're not anywhere near as dark as what these foreground greens are going to be. Otherwise I'll lose that feeling of depth. And we've got the sunlit rocks. So for that, I'll start with some burnt sienna. And some raw umber. And I'll vary that once I get going. This hill predominantly is made up of this warm colour, so I'll start with that. And I want to create some nice broken edges around here. Take some paint out of the brush. And we'll fill the rest of this in. I'll leave a few areas untouched. You can see hints of these masks that I masked before, and that's what allows me to paint this very quickly. All right, now I'm going to go into this next layer of green. These are the shadow areas amongst all the bright canopy. And just some splatter to add a bit of variety to these shapes. Try not to get too many dots in the sky. Let's do the rock edge. I've just added some burnt sienna mix into this cooler green. Just to add some more warmth. Good. All right, let's let that sit there. Let's mix the colour for this water. I'm mixing a lot of paint here. The reason for that is, one, it's a big shape, and two, whatever's left I'll use for the darker trees. Some French ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, just to grey it off a bit. And a small amount of cobalt turquoise. So the distant water is going to be quite a bit lighter than this area. Even here, this will be a bit lighter than that, but then it'll get darker as we move down into this section. too dark, so I'll just dip my brush in water. Paint in some ripples, bigger ones in the foreground, getting smaller in the distance. Got to do this very quickly. Now I'm just spraying that water area because it's drying a little bit too fast. It's very hot in my studio today. I've got reflection of this hill in the water. Where the wet rocks are at the water's edge, they're usually quite a bit darker. So for that, I need to mix a little puddle of mainly French ultramarine and burnt sienna. Now here, notice I only wanted a little bit of moisture in my brush, so rather than dipping the brush in the water, which would have given me more water than I wanted, I just picked up some of this dark grey colour because it works as a base for this dark brown that I needed, and then just added French ultramarine and burnt sienna to it. Don't overload your brush. I'm going to lift a little bit of the blue from underneath some of these boats. It'll just help me paint in their reflections later. Now this has got to dry, and then we'll put in this mass of foliage in the foreground. You have to be very careful when re-wetting the back that you don't get water on the front of the painting, otherwise it'll lift very easily. Now, let's mix all this foreground foliage, and you can see from the reference there's some brighter greens, but most of it's a very dark shape, and I'm going to simplify all of that. I'm not going to be trying to paint every leaf. What I'm trying to do with this painting is to capture the atmosphere, and The atmosphere that we see is this bright, warm afternoon light. Whether the leaves are of a particular size or in a particular position, that's really not that important. So I have a technique that will allow me to create the impression of leaves without putting in too much detail. But to retain this feeling of space, I have to make sure these tones in the foreground are much stronger than anything in the distance. Creating the darks for this can be quite scary for students because we're going to be mixing a lot of paint, and it's dark paint, which means we're going to use a lot more pigment. Let's start with lots of French ultramarine. A little bit of burnt sienna. Cobalt turquoise. Some aureolin. Good. And then we've got some brighter greens, not very bright, but so they're not as bright as this, but we can use that as a base. That's good. I have to go and dry this some more. I missed a step here. Once I dried it, I should have lifted all this masking. So that's my next step. So let me go dry that again. All right, so we've got our darkest green here. We've got the brightest green in the foreground here. Mixing a dark brown colour, not quite black, and this will be for a lot of the trunks and foliage. And primarily it's just French ultramarine and burnt sienna. So my game plan is to create an interesting pattern of foliage that encases this sort of bright area here, so that as the eye moves through the dark tones, it keeps coming back into this section of the painting. I'll pick up my darkest green. It's a bit too turquoisey, so I'll add some more French ultramarine, a little bit of aureolin, and some raw umber. barely touching the paper with my brush, almost parallel to the paper, and it's this part of the brush head that's actually doing most of the work. The point itself doesn't often touch the paper. Change the angle of the brush stroke. Now, while that's still quite wet, I'll pick up a size 8 brush. I'll paint in some branches. I'll grab my rigger. Sometimes use the side of the rigger just to add a little bit of texture or to break up a sharp edge. So notice I've started up here and now I'm just moving around this shape, so the leading edge should always stay workable. And I create some variations in the foliage. Just anything I can produce with quick brush marks, however. vary the colour here and there. And I'm leaving some glimpses of the water through the foliage. Grab my fan brush. Again, different foliage. Just some dabbing that creates yet another type of foliage. So again, I'm looking at the big shape and hinting at the detail rather than trying to paint every leaf. Straight away I knew that wasn't dark enough in tone, so I have to thicken this paint up. And here you can see how I'm letting these various paints, the light paint flowing into the dark paint and the dark into darker paint. and I'm concentrating on creating interesting patterns. Notice my foliage, most of it is interconnected. So these broken edges act as lost and found edges as well. I'm adding some cad orange into this green mix. The cad orange, being an opaque pigment, or reasonably opaque pigment, will sit on top of some of these other colours and add a little bit more texture. We'll let this dry and I can work on the boats. So you can see why I didn't paint the boats first, because most of them are going to be wiped out. Mainly these boats here I have to do some work on. One last thing while this is drying, if I see areas that I feel are looking a bit flat, I can use a rounded corner on my card to scrape in a few little highlights. Just don't want to overdo it. Let's let that dry. Okay, so now we really just have to finish with the boat, the boat shed and a few other small shapes like that. Let me clean some of these brushes. I'm going to clean some of this palette to give myself some mixing area. Just mixing a dull blue-grey colour for some of these boats. Just some burnt sienna and cobalt blue, give you a nice blue-grey. And just use that to hint at a reflection. Don't make the reflection of the mast too straight. Usually find a dark line where the water hits the edge of the boat. Main thing is to make your reflections directly below the object you're reflecting. Just hinting at these shapes, I'm not trying to put in any detail. Just a little bit more detail there. Too much. some cerulean blue. Just a hint here and there. Going in with that clean brush, just touching that dark line I put there, gives the boat some nice curvature. Just hinting at some figures. Now there's a few areas where I've painted through the masts, so for those I'm going to just get some white gouache and we'll fix them up in a minute. Just dull that with a little bit of grey from my palette. Barely touching the paper for some of these marks. This boat is mostly in shadow, so you wouldn't expect a really bright mast. Just adding a bit of warmth to some of these boats. Sometimes I spend more time on these little details than I do on the rest of the painting. So I'm happy with the painting. One of my aims was to capture the glow on this hill and to really paint a lot of detail with a minimum of brush strokes. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.